The planet of Aelara had always been a place of remarkable beauty and advanced technology. Towering cities of shimmering crystal and metal stretched toward the sky, their surfaces reflecting the light of Aelara's twin suns. Rivers of liquid energy flowed through the streets, powering homes, schools, and research centers. The Aelarians had built a society that, to outsiders, might have seemed perfect. They were intelligent, peaceful, and curious. They had explored much of their own world and had mastered technologies that allowed them to manipulate energy, travel across great distances on their planet, and communicate instantly with each other. But no matter how advanced they were, even the Aelarians had limits. Their planet was not stable. Deep within its core, geological changes had begun to accelerate at a terrifying pace. Tremors that had once been minor now shook entire cities. Cracks were forming across the land, releasing bursts of hot gas and energy that could destroy everything in their path. The scientists worked tirelessly, running calculations and simulations, but nothing they tried could stop the destruction. They built barriers, stabilized certain regions, and evacuated some cities, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. The situation was growing worse with every passing day. In the High Council of Aelara, the leaders debated their options. They had rules against calling for help from other civilizations, believing it was better to solve problems on their own. But now, there were no options left. The planet's survival depended on them asking for assistance, a decision that filled the council chambers with fear and uncertainty. Some council members argued that calling for help could bring dangerous consequences. They had heard stories of other species that did not act with kindness, and they feared the wrath or demands of an unknown civilization. Yet the tremors continued, and massive fissures tore through once great cities. Children cried, families fled, and the once strong cities trembled as if in pain. Finally, the council agreed that they had no choice. They decided to send a formal plea to the universe, targeting civilizations known for their power and efficiency. After consulting the galaxy's historical records and databases, one name kept appearing: the Deathworlders. Legends described them as the ultimate survivors, beings who had conquered deadly planets and outlasted every challenge. Their reputation was fearsome. Stories said they could withstand extreme environments, adapt instantly to any threat, and defeat any enemy who underestimated them. The council debated long and hard about the risk. Some argued that the Deathworlders might not even respond. Others warned that if they did, the response could be violent. But desperation outweighed fear. The survival of Aelara had to come first. The message was prepared with extreme care. It was unlike any other communication the Aelarians had ever sent. The council instructed their top scientists and linguists to encode every detail about the planet's crisis, the urgency of the situation, and their plea for mercy. They wanted the Deathworlders to understand that Aelara did not seek conquest or revenge, only assistance. Every symbol, sound, and energy pulse in the transmission was chosen to express honesty and vulnerability. The Aelarians believed that their careful work might appeal to the Deathworlders' sense of logic, if not compassion. After months of preparation, the moment finally arrived. The signal was launched, traveling across the vast expanse of space at unimaginable speeds. Every member of the council watched the monitors, tracking the progress of their plea. For hours there was silence, only the faint hum of the communication system. The aliens waited with bated breath, hoping for some response, a confirmation, a signal, anything. Every day the tremors worsened. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated as massive cracks split the land. The stress and fear among the Aelarians grew. Many slept only a few hours a night, their minds racing with thoughts of what might happen if the Deathworlders never arrived. Then one day, strange lights appeared in the sky. Energy flares, bright and pulsing, streaked across the heavens, moving faster than any natural phenomenon. The people of Alara stared in awe and fear. Was this the answer they had been waiting for? Some scientists examined the readings carefully, realizing that these were not random cosmic events. The flares carried patterns, signals, and codes that indicated intelligence. For the first time in months, a spark of hope lit up the hearts of the council and the citizens alike. Perhaps help was coming. Even as excitement spread, caution remained. The legends of the Deathworlders were not comforting. They were terrifying. The council remembered stories of planets that had fallen before the arrival of these beings, civilizations wiped out before they could resist. But hope had to outweigh fear. They prepared to welcome the unknown visitors, building temporary shelters, stockpiling food, and securing critical energy sources. Citizens were given instructions: stay calm, cooperate, and follow the guidance of emergency teams. Schools and work centers were closed. Families gathered together, unsure of what was about to happen. The sense of uncertainty filled every street, every home, and every mind. The council sent out smaller reconnaissance signals to try to communicate directly with the approaching force, but no response came. Only the flares moved, distant and bright, growing closer with each passing hour. The people of Alara watched as the sky darkened with the massive shadows of incoming ships, larger than any they had ever seen. Panic and awe mixed together. Reality hit. Their message had been received. But what did the Deathworlders intend to do? Would they arrive as saviors or as conquerors? The council could only hope, praying that their carefully worded plea for mercy had been understood. In the quiet moments before the first contact, families held each other tightly, children clung to their parents, and the council sat in tense silence. The fate of Alara, the future of their people, and the survival of their planet now rested in the hands of a civilization unlike any they had ever faced. The Aelarians could only wait, hearts pounding, minds racing, and eyes fixed on the approaching light in the sky. The first chapter of a story that would change their planet forever was about to begin. The sky above Alara darkened as the massive ships drew closer, casting long, intimidating shadows over cities that had once gleamed under the twin suns. The people of Alara watched in stunned silence, their earlier hope mingled with fear. These were no ordinary travelers. The ships were enormous, far larger than any of the planet's own creations, with smooth, metallic surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each ship moved with a precision and speed that spoke of unimaginable power. The citizens clutched one another, whispering prayers and comforting words that did little to calm their racing hearts. The first pods began to separate from the larger ships, descending rapidly toward the planet's surface. They were small, but in number, they were overwhelming. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, fell like raindrops from the sky, their descent perfectly synchronized. Panic spread through the streets. Families ran for safety as sirens blared across the cities, warning citizens to take cover. Emergency response teams tried to maintain order, but it was clear that the Aelarians were facing something they had never prepared for. The council watched from the safety of their command center, faces pale with tension. They had believed their carefully crafted message would convey a request for help. They had hoped for negotiation, discussion, maybe even a display of understanding. What they had not expected was this: a full-scale deployment of forces that could be described as terrifying only in the mildest terms. The Deathworlders had arrived, and there would be no conversation, only action. The first squads hit the ground with explosive efficiency. Each pod opened like a flower, revealing warriors clad in dark, durable armor that seemed to ripple and shift as if alive. The aliens tried to communicate, projecting messages of peace and pleading for mercy. But the Deathworlders did not pause. Their communication was not in words. It was in observation, analysis, and immediate action. They moved through the cities with precision, identifying weaknesses, bypassing traps, and neutralizing threats with strategies that the Alarians had never imagined. Buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled under the impact of the Deathworlders' equipment. Streets that had been wide and open became chaotic zones of fleeing citizens, falling debris, and flashes of energy as defensive systems attempted to resist. Yet every move the aliens made was anticipated. Defensive drones were intercepted, energy shields bypassed, and evacuation routes blocked. The Iolarians were forced to confront a painful truth. The beings they had called for mercy were not like anyone they had ever known. In the chaos, smaller groups of citizens tried to hide or escape. Some fled to high towers, hoping the invaders would not reach them. Others huddled in underground shelters, praying that the reinforced barriers could withstand the onslaught. Still, the Deathworlders moved with methodical precision. Their sensors detected movement, their calculations predicted outcomes, and their actions were decisive. The invaders did not appear angry or cruel. They simply acted according to a logic the Alarians could not comprehend. To the aliens, it seemed as though their planet itself was under siege by a force of nature that was intelligent and relentless. Amid the fear, small acts of bravery emerged. Citizens who had once been ordinary suddenly found courage. Scientists, who had spent their lives in laboratories, now led groups through alternate routes, guiding them away from danger. Engineers repurposed construction equipment to create barriers and distractions. Soldiers who had been trained for defense found themselves facing a new kind of enemy, one whose skills outmatched anything they had ever encountered. Every success was small but significant, a fleeting spark of hope in a sea of overwhelming threat. The Council, watching from their command center, realized that their earlier hope for negotiation was gone. The Deathworlders had not come to talk. They had come to respond in the only way they knew how. It was not vengeance and it was not cruelty. It was survival logic. To the Deathworlders, the signal for help was interpreted as a sign of weakness. Any civilization showing vulnerability might be incapable of handling its own survival, and therefore intervention was necessary. The council members felt a mix of horror and awe. Their carefully worded plea had been heard, but the interpretation had turned their lives upside down. The invasion did not aim to destroy indiscriminately. The Deathworlders did not attack children or non-combatants without cause. Instead, they focused on neutralizing resistance efficiently, clearing paths, and establishing dominance over critical areas. The aliens began to notice patterns in the invaders' behavior. They were calculating, precise, and adaptive. Every failed defense prompted a new, more sophisticated strategy from the Deathworlders. Each attempt to escape was anticipated. The Alarians began to understand that their survival depended not on strength alone, but on observation, adaptation, and ingenuity. As the day turned into night, the cities were unrecognizable. Streets that had been filled with laughter and movement were now scenes of chaos and fear. The glow of energy barriers mixed with the harsh light of landing pods, creating a surreal, almost dreamlike scene. Families continued to flee, huddling, together wherever they could find shelter. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to maintain communication networks, trying to coordinate evacuations and manage resources. Every corner of the planet was affected. Even remote areas previously untouched by disaster felt the presence of the Deathworlders. Despite the fear, some citizens began to find inspiration in the unexpected. Leaders emerged from among ordinary people, guiding groups through safe paths and devising new strategies to avoid capture. Communities that had been isolated came together, sharing resources, knowledge, and courage. The presence of the Deathworlders, terrifying as it was, forced the aliens to act in ways they had never imagined. They discovered hidden strengths, learned to anticipate danger, and realized that survival required not only fear, but cleverness and unity. By the end of the first day, the initial shock had passed, but the threat remained. The Deathworlders had established a presence on the planet, but the Aelarians were beginning to adapt. Their understanding of the invaders was still limited, but their determination to survive was growing. The first contact had been terrifying, almost overwhelming, but it had also awakened a new sense of purpose. The aliens understood that this encounter would shape their planet, their civilization, and their very way of life. As the first night settled over Ilara, the people looked to the sky where the enormous ships hovered silently, almost like stars that had fallen from the heavens. They did not know what would come next, only that the days ahead would test them in ways they had never imagined. The hope for mercy had transformed into a struggle for survival, and for the first time the Aelarians understood the true meaning of the signal they had sent. Help had arrived, but it was not the kind they had expected. The morning after the first contact arrived, the full impact of the Deathworlder invasion became clear. The alien cities, once filled with light, music, and movement, now seemed like war zones. Streets were cracked, buildings partially collapsed, and smoke rose from areas where defensive systems had failed. The survivors moved cautiously, trying to avoid the invaders while still finding food, shelter, and ways to communicate. It became obvious that the Deathworlders were not just passing through. They were here with a purpose, one that the Aelarians could neither fully understand nor resist easily. The Deathworlders moved like shadows, silent, precise, and unstoppable. Their armored suits allowed them to cross terrain that would have been impossible for the aliens. They could leap great distances, move through energy barriers, and even resist environmental hazards that had previously threatened the Aelarians. To the humans watching from a distance, or in this case, the aliens, it seemed as though the invaders had become part of the planet itself, flowing through cities and landscapes with ease. Every movement was deliberate, and every action calculated. The Council of Aelara gathered in the remains of their command center, analyzing reports as they came in. Communications with the farthest cities were spotty, often cut off by the presence of the Deathworlders. Sensors detected clusters of the invaders, moving through residential areas, bypassing traps and neutralizing small groups of resistance. Each report painted a picture of efficiency and logic, not cruelty. The Deathworlders did not attack randomly or unnecessarily. They simply acted according to a survival-based system that prioritized elimination of threats and control of strategic points. While fear spread, small acts of defiance began to appear. A group of young engineers who had once worked on energy networks now repurposed their knowledge into tactical tools. They set up diversions, creating false energy signals to mislead the Deathworlders and allow citizens to escape. Others in the scientific community developed emergency shelters capable of withstanding the invaders' scanning technology for short periods. Though these efforts were small, they gave the Aelarians a sense of hope. It became clear that survival depended not on hiding but on thinking like the enemy, understanding their logic, and acting accordingly. The Deathworlders' approach to invasion was methodical. They first secured central areas, neutralized defensive technology, and mapped out escape routes. Then they moved to residential zones, observing patterns, calculating weaknesses, and responding instantly to resistance. To the Aelarians, it was terrifying. Each failure, no matter how minor, resulted in rapid, decisive action by the invaders. The people began to understand that conventional defenses, energy shields, fortified walls, and automated weapons, were not enough. Survival required adaptation and learning at a speed they had never experienced. Amid the chaos, leaders began to emerge from unlikely places. Citizens who had once been engineers, teachers, and researchers now directed groups of survivors. They coordinated evacuations, established safe routes, and created signals to alert others of impending danger. Small victories were achieved when groups managed to avoid Deathworlder patrols or redirect them away from populated areas. Each success, though temporary, strengthened morale and reinforced the idea that intelligence and strategy were the keys to survival. The Council noticed that the Deathworlders were testing them as much as attacking them. Every obstacle the aliens created was carefully studied, every trap quickly analyzed, and every escape route anticipated. The invaders adjusted their tactics based on the Aelarians' behavior, forcing them to think faster, act smarter, and make difficult decisions under pressure. It was a brutal education in survival, and the aliens realized that their civilization would need to evolve rapidly if it was to endure this encounter. In the middle of this turmoil, families were scattered and reunited in surprising ways. Communities that had been isolated began to share information, resources, and strategies. Parents who had feared for their children's safety discovered that cooperation increased their chances of survival. In one city, a small group of engineers and citizens created a temporary safe zone in an underground network of tunnels where over 100 people could remain hidden while continuing to plan defenses. These pockets of resistance became beacons of hope in a world that seemed increasingly controlled by the invaders. At the same time, the aliens began to realize the scale of the Deathworlders' abilities. They could survive without food or water for long periods, withstand extreme temperatures, and move through environments that were lethal to ordinary life. Their observation skills were unmatched. They could track patterns, anticipate movements, and act in ways that often seemed impossible. For the Aelarians, each encounter was a lesson in humility. They began to understand that these invaders were not motivated by cruelty. They were motivated by a survival logic that demanded efficiency and precision above all else. As days passed, the initial terror of the invasion began to transform into cautious determination. While the Deathworlders continued their methodical expansion across the planet, the surviving Aelarians adapted. They learned to read the movements of the invaders, predict patrol routes, and develop small countermeasures. Even minor acts of success, such as diverting a patrol or protecting a group of civilians, were celebrated as victories. Each action reinforced the growing realization that survival was possible, but only if the aliens could learn to act as quickly, intelligently, and strategically as the Deathworlders themselves. Amid all this, the Council began to reconsider its earlier assumptions. The initial hope for mercy had been naive. They now understood that the response of the Deathworlders was not emotional, it was logical. Help, if it was to come, would come only to those who proved capable of surviving under extreme conditions. Mercy was not given freely. It had to be earned through resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. This realization reshaped the Council's plans. Instead of waiting for intervention, they would focus on empowering citizens, teaching survival strategies, and creating networks of cooperation across the planet. By the end of the third day, the Aelarians had learned to adapt under pressure. Entire regions of the planet were still under threat, but small groups of survivors had begun to emerge as skilled, intelligent, and resourceful. The Deathworlders remained a terrifying presence, but their methodical approach forced the aliens to grow stronger, faster, and smarter. The lessons learned in these first days of invasion would shape not only the survivors' immediate strategies, but the very foundation of Aelara's future. As night fell, the Deathworlder ships hovered silently. Above the cities, their presence a constant reminder of the challenge ahead. The Aelarians, exhausted but resolute, knew that their survival depended on more than hiding. They had to adapt, learn, and act with intelligence and courage. The invasion had begun in full, and the planet was being reshaped in ways no one could have predicted. Yet within the chaos, a new determination had begun to rise. The aliens understood that fear alone would not save them, but strategy, cooperation, and the courage to act might. The story of Aelara had entered a new phase. The Deathworlders were here not as negotiators, but as catalysts, forcing the aliens to face the true meaning of survival. Every decision, every movement, and every choice now carried consequences. The lessons of these days would echo for generations. And as the night sky glimmered with the light of hovering ships, the people of Elara knew that the struggle had only just begun, and that the coming days would test them in ways they had never imagined. But they also realized, for the first time, that survival was not impossible. The invasion had entered its fourth day, and the people of Elara had begun to see that survival required more than fear. It demanded quick thinking, adaptation, and cooperation. While the Deathworlders continued to move with precise efficiency, across the planet, the Elarians were learning to anticipate their actions. Small victories became possible, not because the aliens had power equal to the invaders, but because they had begun to understand their logic. They were learning to think like their opponents, predicting their moves and adjusting their strategies. In cities that had been nearly destroyed, survivors gathered in hidden areas. They used underground tunnels, abandoned buildings, and even natural caves to organize themselves. Leaders emerged among them. Teachers, engineers, scientists, and ordinary citizens who discovered courage they did not know they possessed. These new leaders coordinated groups of survivors, teaching them to move quietly, use distractions effectively, and communicate without being detected. Every successful escape, every avoided encounter became a lesson for the next group. The Deathworlders, meanwhile, continued their methodical approach. They advanced in patterns that were frighteningly predictable, yet adaptable. Their focus was on observing and responding to threats rather than attacking indiscriminately. This behavior forced the aliens to constantly think ahead. If a patrol was coming down a street, they would reroute citizens, set up temporary diversions, or create false signals to mislead the invaders. It was a game of strategy, one in which every small mistake could have devastating consequences. Amid this tense atmosphere, engineers and scientists became the unexpected heroes. They repurposed city infrastructure for defense, using energy fields, holographic projections, and decoy signals to confuse the Deathworlders. Children and teenagers, once considered too young to contribute, played critical roles in carrying messages, observing patrol patterns, and helping evacuate families. The planet was in chaos, yet it was in this chaos that resilience began to grow. The Aelarians realized that survival was no longer just about hiding. It was about using every resource, every skill, and every mind to outthink their invaders. The council worked tirelessly alongside the citizens. Meetings were held in secure locations, sometimes underground or in reinforced buildings. Plans were drawn and redrawn based on reports from survivors on the ground. Every successful diversion or trap became part of a growing body of knowledge that could be shared across the planet. Slowly, the aliens were learning not just to survive, but to coordinate, strategize, and adapt to a threat that seemed unstoppable. One key realization changed everything. The Deathworlders did not act out of malice. They were precise, logical, and focused on outcomes. They responded to threats with efficiency, but they did not destroy unnecessarily. Understanding this allowed the Aelarians to change their mindset. Instead of panicking at every movement, they observed patterns, learned behaviors, and adapted accordingly. This shift in thinking gave them a sense of control that had been absent in the first days of the invasion. Fear remained, but it was now accompanied by intelligence and strategy. Some of the most inspiring moments came from cooperation across communities. Cities that had been isolated shared knowledge of traps, safe routes, and Deathworlder behaviors. Engineers who had once competed for resources now worked together to create energy diversions and safe shelters. Farmers, once focused solely on food production, learned to guide small groups through fields and forests to avoid detection. The entire society, though scattered and stressed, was learning to function as a coordinated system, using every available mind and skill to survive. Even the youngest members of society contributed in meaningful ways. Children who had once played in parks now learned to signal warnings using light patterns, sound signals, and subtle movements. They became scouts, observing patterns in Deathworlder patrols and reporting back to leaders. Their observations, though small individually, often made the difference between safety and capture. Every citizen, regardless of age or previous role, now had a part to play in the planet's survival. Despite these small successes, the Deathworlders remained an overwhelming presence. Entire neighborhoods were under their watchful eyes, and any mistake could result in rapid intervention. The aliens understood that they could not challenge the invaders head-on. Instead, they relied on cleverness, coordination, and distraction. Every encounter became a test of intellect, strategy, and courage. The invaders' precision forced the Alarians to develop skills and strategies that no one had imagined possible before the invasion began. As the days passed, the aliens began to notice patterns in the Deathworlders' behavior that allowed them to anticipate movements with increasing accuracy. They realized that the invaders responded predictably to certain types of energy signals and structural obstacles. By using decoys, temporary barriers, and clever diversions, they were able to create safe corridors for groups to move from one part of the city to another. Each successful operation became a building block for more complex strategies, allowing larger groups to escape detection and establish new safe zones. The Council also began to implement training programs. Citizens were taught how to recognize Deathworlder patrol patterns, avoid energy detection fields, and communicate silently. The survivors became a network of intelligence, sharing knowledge in real time through secure communication lines and hidden messages. The planet's inhabitants, once passive in the face of disaster, were now active participants in their own survival. Every individual had become a part of a growing system of resistance, each action contributing to the larger goal of enduring the invasion. Even as the aliens adapted, they remained aware of the immense challenge before them. The Deathworlders were not easily deceived, and the threat remained constant. Every decision carried risk, yet in the midst of this pressure, the people of Ialara discovered a new sense of strength. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act wisely and strategically in the presence of danger. Communities became tighter, leaders became wiser, and the survivors learned that intelligence, cooperation, and resilience were just as powerful as any weapon. By the end of the fourth day, the Ilarians had transformed. What had begun as a frightened, desperate population had become a resilient, coordinated, and resourceful society. They were still under threat, and the Deathworlders remained an intimidating presence, but they had learned to survive, adapt, and fight in ways they had never imagined. The lessons of these days would carry forward, shaping the strategies, thinking, and courage of the planet's citizens for the challenges yet to come. As night fell, the Deathworlder ships continued to hover over the cities, their lights piercing the darkness. The invaders remained vigilant, but the people below had learned to move wisely, anticipate dangers, and protect one another. The first stage of adaptation was complete, and Alara's survivors were no longer entirely at the mercy of the invaders. They had learned a crucial lesson. Survival depended on intelligence, coordination, and the courage to act even when the odds seemed impossible. In the quiet moments before sleep, the citizens reflected on what had happened. Entire cities had been tested, families had been scattered and reunited, and a civilization had been forced to grow stronger in record time. The Deathworlders had arrived not to destroy for cruelty, but to enforce a harsh logic that demanded adaptation. And in response, the aliens had begun to rise, not with weapons or anger, but with knowledge, strategy, and courage. The stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter that would test whether their newfound skills could truly ensure survival. Days had passed since the initial invasion, and the people of Alara had begun to understand that the presence of the Deathworlders was not simply a challenge. They were a force that demanded growth, adaptability, and intelligence. The planet had changed, its cities scarred, its landscapes altered, but in the hearts of its citizens, a new strength had emerged. Fear remained, but it was now tempered with strategy, courage, and determination. The aliens had learned that survival was not about hiding or pleading. It was about acting wisely, quickly, and together. The Deathworlders, observing from above and within the cities, continued their methodical presence. Their patrols moved with precision, scanning every street, every building, and every movement. To the aliens, their logic remained mysterious but consistent. Each intervention was calculated, responding only to actions that could threaten the order or stability of the area. The Alarians had begun to respect this logic, understanding that the invaders were not cruel, they were efficient. By comprehending their behavior, the aliens could finally find ways to coexist with the immediate threat while preparing for long-term survival. The survivors had become highly organized. Communities had formed networks of communication using signals, messengers, and hidden paths. Safe zones were established in areas the Deathworlders rarely patrolled, and citizens rotated responsibilities to maintain constant vigilance. Every individual, regardless of age or skill, had a role. Children helped relay messages. Engineers repaired shelters and barriers, and leaders coordinated strategy and movement. What had begun as isolated pockets of survival was now a planet-wide effort. The aliens had transformed from a frightened population into a resilient and intelligent society. One remarkable development was the emergence of cooperation among former rivals. In the early days of the invasion, competition for resources had caused tension, but the shared threat forced the Alarians to put aside differences. Knowledge, food, and tools were shared freely, and strategies were communicated openly. The people learned that collective intelligence was far stronger than individual effort. Even the smallest contributions had significance. A single diversion, a clever signal, or a well-planned evacuation could save dozens of lives. Survival had become a communal effort, and the bonds forged during these days would endure far beyond the immediate crisis. The Deathworlders, having observed the rapid adaptation of the aliens, began to shift their approach subtly. They no longer treated every movement as a threat, instead focusing on maintaining order and ensuring that the planet's systems remained functional enough to support life. They allowed certain areas to remain untouched, seemingly studying the Alarians' new behaviors. The aliens noticed that by demonstrating intelligence, caution, and strategic thinking, they could influence the invaders' actions. It was not mercy in the traditional sense, it was recognition of capability. The Deathworlders respected survival and skill, and the Alarians were beginning to prove themselves. As the invasion progressed, the Council recognized that the planet's future depended on lessons learned during this crisis. They began teaching citizens advanced survival skills, combining old knowledge with insights gained from observing the Deathworlders. They trained people to read environmental signs, anticipate threats, and coordinate complex operations. This knowledge extended beyond immediate survival. It was a foundation for a society that could thrive even in the face of future challenges. The invasion had become unexpectedly a harsh but effective education in resilience. Communities also began to repair and rebuild parts of the cities that had been damaged. Structures were reinforced, energy systems restored, and safe zones expanded. The presence of the Deathworlders forced efficiency. Repairs had to be done quickly and wisely, with minimal waste of resources. Every construction project was also a strategic operation, ensuring that the aliens' movements and defenses were integrated seamlessly. In this way, the planet's physical recovery became inseparable from the survival of its people. Cities were not just rebuilt, they were transformed into intelligent networks of safety, observation, and coordination. Families reunited in heartwarming ways. Children who had been separated from parents found safety through coordinated efforts, while siblings and neighbors discovered ways to support one another in a system now based on mutual protection. These reunions were small victories, moments of relief and joy amidst the ongoing tension. They reminded the Elarians that despite the scars and challenges, life continued, and hope could persist, even in extreme circumstances. By the end of the first week after the invasion began, Alara was no longer the planet it had been. It had been tested, scarred, and pushed to its limits, but the citizens had adapted in ways no one had anticipated. The Deathworlders, having completed the initial objectives of their response, began to withdraw gradually. They left the planet not destroyed, but altered. The Alarians had survived, not through luck, but through intelligence, courage, and unity. They had earned a form of respect from the invaders by demonstrating the ability to survive under extreme conditions. The Council reflected on what had been learned. The message they had sent for mercy had been received, but it had been interpreted differently than expected. The Deathworlders had responded not with sympathy, but with logic and efficiency. The lesson was clear. Survival was not given, it was earned. Yet in responding to this harsh logic, the Elarians had grown stronger, smarter, and more coordinated than ever before. They realized that the crisis, as terrifying as it had been, had accelerated their civilization's growth and forced them to unlock potential they never knew existed. As life on Aelara began to stabilize, the survivors knew that the planet would never return to its old form. Cities would bear the marks of the invasion, and the memory of fear would remain. Yet they also carried a new sense of capability, confidence, and unity. Individuals who had once felt powerless had discovered resilience. Communities that had been isolated had learned the value of cooperation, and the society as a whole had learned to respond intelligently and strategically to challenges, no matter how overwhelming. The Deathworlders' presence became part of the planet's history. Though they eventually left, their arrival and methods remained a lesson for generations. The Aelarians had learned that the universe was vast and often harsh, and that survival required more than technology or comfort. It required intelligence, observation, cooperation, and courage. The story of those days became a foundational tale passed down to teach children and adults alike about resilience, strategic thinking, and the power of unity. In the quiet moments after the withdrawal of the Deathworlders, the people of Aelara looked to the sky. They no longer feared the unknown in the same way. They had faced a force beyond anything they had imagined, and though the cost had been great, they had survived. Their planet was changed, their civilization tested, but they had emerged stronger. And in that strength they found hope. They understood that the universe was vast, unpredictable, and sometimes harsh, but they were ready. They were capable. They were alive. Aelara had been forced to evolve under fire, and it had done so. The citizens, once fearful and unprepared, had become resilient, intelligent, and united. They would remember the terror, the challenges, and the lessons learned from the Deathworlders. But more importantly, they would remember that survival was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The planet had changed, its people had changed, and a new era of awareness, courage, and preparation had begun. The story of Aelara was no longer just about fear. It was about adaptation, resilience, and the unyielding will to survive.